They called Eli McCrae a mass murderer. The papers in his truck told a different story. Morning frost clung to the pasture grass as Sheriff Boyd Ramsey stepped past the first body at the Boundary Oak, breath hanging white in the air. 13 men lay scattered along that fence line, every one of them tied, somehow, to stolen liquor and a crooked pasture survey. From above, it looked less like rage and more like a map someone had traced in blood. Years later, folks in Breathitt County still argue about what really happened here and why. Tonight we're going to walk that fence, follow the paper trail Eli built, and ask whether this was evil, justice, or both. Before we get down into this hollow, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and if stories like this hit close to home. If you want more hard mountain cases told plain, you might think about subscribing as we step into the Kentucky Hill Country killings of 1983 together tonight. From that frosted pasture and those bodies, the story walks backward into the hollow that made men like Eli McCrae and Calvin Hensley. On a damp Sunday in 1979, the church basement under New Hope Baptist smelled like green beans, ham, and strong coffee. Long tables bowed under casserole dishes. Men in worn jackets talked low, while kids chased each other between metal folding chairs. Coal jobs had dried up. A sewing plant in town had shut its doors. More than one man there was on disability in name, but still needed odd work to keep lights on. In that room, people swapped news on who was hiring, who'd sold a cow, who might have a little extra liquor to move. Ruth Ann Napier worked the dessert table. She heard talk of wells going dry on one ridge and of a spring on Eli's line that never runs out, no matter the summer. In these hills, a steady spring meant more than a paycheck. Quiet in the corner, Eli listened. He knew his herd was small. He knew his boys might not have factories to walk into like some cousins had once done. What he had instead was dirt, that cold, clear water, and a recipe written in his daddy's script. Illegal stills were no secret. Everyone knew who had one and who pretended they didn't. But there was a line most wouldn't cross. You didn't steal another man's place to set up, and you didn't take his way of making mash. Folks called that taking his name. The hollow ran on that code. Formal law sat miles away at the courthouse, behind oak doors and typed forms. Here, honor and memory carried more weight. That tension between courthouse rules and mountain rules is where this whole case starts to heat up. After that church supper, the camera of our story follows Eli home, up a rutted gravel lane to a white, sagging farmhouse set against a dark timber line. Inside, Mary Jo stirred beans on the stove, while Danny and Joel argued over a radio ball game. Eli eased past them, boots leaving dry mud on the floor, and stepped into the small bedroom he'd grown up in. A dented coffee can sat in the closet, under old feed sacks. He pulled it out, slow and careful. Inside lay 3 things: a folded land deed from 1946 with McCrae written in fountain pen, a hand-drawn map showing the pasture and spring, and a narrow strip of paper with mash notes in his father's tight handwriting. Beside them rested a small New Testament with births and deaths written inside the cover. "Someday this'll all be yours," his father had told him years before, standing by the Boundary Oak. "Not riches, but it's ours." Eli had taken that to heart. He rose before dawn, fed cattle in sleet, and fixed fence by flashlight. He ran small, careful liquor loads through friendly hands, never greedy, never bold. Pride and worry rode on his shoulders in equal weight. What most neighbors never saw was his habit of tucking every receipt, every letter, into boxes under the bed. He kept school notes, tax slips, vet bills, and a spiral notebook where he logged calves born, gallons cooked, and money owed. That quiet record-keeping gave him a sense of control in a world that never felt stable. He didn't know it yet, but those boxes and that coffee can would one day speak for him louder than any lawyer ever could. While Eli guarded that can and those boxes, Cal Hensley watched from the next ridge over. Cal had grown up running the same creeks, sitting in the same school desks. He laughed easy, slapped backs, and always had a story ready. Folks liked him. They said Cal could sell ice to an Eskimo. Under the charm, though, lay fear. 3 kids, a wife with bad lungs, and a mortgage hanging over red clay. For years, he and Eli fixed fence together where their pastures met. They shared salt blocks, traded hay bales, and slipped a few jars of clear liquor to the same trusted buyers. On hot days, they sat under the boundary oak, boots in the dust, talking about how things were getting tight. As money pressures grew, Cal started to look harder at Eli's side. He watched where the path to the spring disappeared into brush. He listened when Eli talked in small bits about grain mix and letting the yeast talk. The more Cal saw Eli's liquor bring good prices, the more he felt that he, too, deserved a slice. One late summer, Eli followed fresh tire tracks down a back trail and smelled sour mash in a place there had never been mash before. Hidden in a laurel thicket, just over where Cal liked to claim the boundary ran, sat a new copper still. Barrels sweated close by. A plastic pipe ran up toward Eli's spring. He stood there a long time, jaw tight. Every bubble in that pot felt like a slap. This wasn't just a new still. This was his water, his method, his name, bent into someone else's profit. Right there, under green shade and buzzing gnats, the first hard crack in that old friendship opened. From that laurel thicket, Eli didn't march over and throw punches. He turned his truck toward town. The Breathitt County Courthouse smelled of paper, dust, and old coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Behind a tall counter, a clerk in a cardigan slid big plat books across the worn wood when Eli asked, quiet, to see the McCrae and Hensley land records. He traced lines with a calloused finger. The old deed in his coffee can matched these shapes. An oak tree marked here, a creek bend there. But on a newer survey, pencil marks shifted the fence line just enough to pull that spring toward the Hensley side. "Some of them boys have been in here a lot lately, getting things squared up for some kind of business, I guess." Those words chilled Eli more than any winter wind. On paper, his family's held truth was slipping away. He walked out onto the courthouse steps, squinting into bright noon. For a long time, he sat in his truck, staring at the steering wheel. Part of him wanted to storm up to Cal's porch and demand it all stop. Another part saw how far this had already gone. Fence posts could be moved back, but once ink dried in record books, stories changed forever. Talking won't fix this. Not now, he thought. That afternoon, he bought a cheap folder, some stamps, and a legal pad at the drugstore. At his kitchen table that night, he began copying deeds, dates, and notes onto clean sheets. He wrote his first careful letter to a lawyer 2 counties over, someone who wouldn't be in Cal's pocket. Eli's misjudgment was simple and tragic. He believed that if he built a perfect pile of papers, slow and neat, the system would have to do right. He didn't yet see how slow that system could move, or how much damage Cal would do while the ink dried. Days after those letters went out, Eli headed to the stockyard, folder on the seat beside him. The auction barn rang with cow calls and fast talk. Men lined the rail, chewing tobacco, boots white with dust. Eli and Cal often sold calves together, their brands and names paired on sale slips. It had been that way for years. When the clerk handed Eli a check that day, his fingers paused. Only one name was printed on the top: Calvin Hensley. The old habit of listing McCrae and Hensley had vanished. The clerk shrugged. "That's how it was wrote up," she said. Cal laughed it off when Eli asked. "Paper mix-up," he grinned, clapping Eli's shoulder a bit too hard. "I'll square it." Eli nodded, but he didn't forget. He folded the check copy into his folder with care. On a yellow pad that night, he wrote the date, the head count, and the way the names had changed. Later, by lamplight, Mary Jo watched him scratch out another letter. "Are you really going through with this? Courthouse, lawyers, all of it?" she asked. "They're already there," he answered, voice low. "If I don't get my side wrote down, we're gone, Mare. It's like we were never here." That first letter laid out the basics: family ownership of the pasture, long use of the spring, Eli's recipe passed down. He didn't mention the stills outright, only use of water for farm purposes and prior agreement on shared line. That night, without raising his voice, Eli stepped past any easy road back to normal. From here out, every calf, every jar, every boundary stake would be one more piece of evidence. While Eli built his folder, he kept one old ally close: Ray Fletcher. Ray had run with Eli's father back in the day. He knew where the first still had sat up under a rock ledge long before Eli was born. Ray could point to spots on the ridge and say that there's always been McCrae land, far as any of us remember. One cold March night in 1982, fire trucks clawed up a muddy lane toward Ray's place. Flames tore through his tin-roofed shed, sparks flying into the dark. Men shouted, hoses hissed, but by the time they knocked the blaze down, the shed was a black, twisted hull. Inside had been Ray's little still, his mash barrels, and boxes of his own notes. The official word, written later in the fire report, called it bad wiring. Some in town nodded. Others traded looks that said, maybe, maybe not. Eli stood in the ashes the next morning with the old man, who coughed in the cold smoke. "There goes my say-so," Ray muttered. "All them papers, gone like they never were." "You can still talk," Eli said. Ray shook his head. "Maybe, but paper outlives us, boy." Weeks later, Ray's heart gave out. Age, shock, smoke, hard life, it was all tied together. With him went decades of living memory about who had used what land and water. At his small funeral, Eli watched Cal stand near the back, hat in hand, eyes sliding away whenever Eli looked up. One more voice that might have backed Eli's claim was now dirt in a hilltop grave. That loss pressed Eli deeper into his file folders and notebooks. If living men could vanish overnight, then his only hope, he thought, lay in ink and dates that fire could not so easily erase. By late spring, the quiet work of stealing and selling Eli's recipe had spread far beyond one neighbor. Ruth Ann's store sat at the junction where the gravel road met the blacktop. It sold gas, bread, feed, and gossip. One hot afternoon, Eli pulled in for diesel and stood by his truck, pumping slow, when he saw a sight that made his stomach drop. Cal's boys, barely out of high school, loaded neat cardboard cases into the back of a pickup. Each box showed a printed label, some slick new brand with a mountain on it. Eli didn't need to open one to know how it would taste. Inside the store, Ruth Ann rang them up. She heard Cal lean close to a cousin and say, "Won't be long, we'll have this all proper. Real deals, none of this hiding in the holler." Near the candy rack, young wives held babies while counting out dollars for milk. Their eyes followed the cash passing for that liquor. Hope and worry mixed together. Those jars meant food on tables. They also meant risk if law ever came down. Eli stood by the window display pretending to study fishing lures and listened. Every name Cal spoke, every place he mentioned hauling to went into his head, then onto his yellow pad back home. He wasn't just tracking land now, he was mapping a web, Sons, cousins, partners, all bound together by his stolen method, and that's spring water. That night, he hesitated over one line in his notes, then wrote ages beside certain names. 19, 22, 25. They were old enough to work, old enough in this place to know better. Looking at that list, Eli felt something heavy settle in his chest. If this went bad, it wouldn't only be old men paying a price. By midsummer, Eli's barn loft had turned into a paper war room. A single bulb cast yellow light over hay bales and rough boards. On them he laid out all he'd gathered: copies of deeds, hand-drawn maps, letters from the out-of-county lawyer, auction slips, notes from church talks, and a careful log of every haul he'd seen leave in Hensley trucks. He sorted by date, by name, by place. Threads formed patterns. The new survey work, the calf checks changing names, the sudden flow of labeled jars. In a spiral notebook, Eli wrote a plain story that tied it all together. How his people had held that pasture in spring. How Cal had eased the line on paper. How the stolen recipe had become a growing business. 3 big envelopes lay open beside him, each marked for a different office: county attorney, state revenue, ATF. He made 3 full sets of copies, licking stamps until his tongue felt like paper. Beside those packs, another list rested alone. No envelopes, no stamps, just names in a neat column. Next to each he marked a small note: knows water, taught mash, runs still. Mary Jo came up the loft steps. "Are you mailing them tomorrow?" she asked. "First thing," he said. He didn't mention the second list. When dawn bled gray over the ridge, Eli loaded the envelopes into his truck. He also folded that other list into his shirt pocket, pressing it against his chest. In his mind, one path led through offices and file cabinets. The other led along fence lines through dark woods. "I'll give them a chance to do right," he thought. "If they won't, then it falls back on me." With that, all pieces were set. The papers would fly out into the system. Whatever came back or didn't would decide how bloody this story got. Those envelopes left the McCrae mailbox on a mild November morning. By the next day, the Hollow woke up to gunshots instead. We return now to that frosted pasture under the boundary oak. Sheriff Boyd's breath steamed as he moved from one still body to the next. Deputies marked casings, took photos, and tried not to look too long at faces they'd known since grade school. Down by the gate, state police set up a command post. Radios crackled. Names rolled in. Hensley's, cousins, partners. As lists formed on a patrol car hood, one trooper frowned. "These match something?" he asked. Later, back at Eli's truck, they found a small metal box behind the seat. Inside, under a folded letter to Mary Jo, sat carbon copies of the very packets now making their way to county and federal desks. There was also that second plain sheet with a column of names and small notes. A deputy laid the list next to the victim sheet. It lined up with sickening neatness. A few names near the bottom had no checkmark yet. At almost the same hour, a county clerk down the road slit open a thick envelope and started reading Eli's calm, detailed complaint. In another town, an ATF mailroom stamped a matching packet, tossed it into an in-basket, and moved on. By sundown, news crackled over scanners and kitchen radios. Multiple fatalities in a pasture shooting. No one yet knew how tightly that gun smoke and that paper trail were tied. If you've stayed with me this far, hearing both the calm work Eli did and the horror he unleashed, and you want more long, hard looks at true stories like this, you can hit subscribe. These are not easy tales, but they're the ones that shape places like this. As the sun dropped behind the ridge that first day, lawmen dragged tables into the sheriff's squad room. Maps went up on corkboards. Photos from the pasture joined snapshots of still sites they'd hit over the years. In the middle, taped up in careful rows, were pages copied from Eli's envelopes. Deeds, his hand-drawn map, his letters, and that long list of names and dates. Sheriff Ramsey tapped a finger on Eli's first letter to the county attorney. "He started here," he said. "He tried to do it our way." ATF agent Frank Delgado, far from home and speaking in a flat city voice, nodded. He laid out a full conspiracy case and a land dispute, and then before we could act, he executed his own warrants. County Attorney Linda Carmichael flipped through the pages. "She wasn't crazy," she said softly. "She was organized, methodical. He knew exactly who was tied into this." A trooper pointed at a line on the map. "This new survey, that's what moves the spring onto Hensley paper." He traced down to the still sites Eli had sketched. "Matches what we've seen in the field." 13 dead, another deputy muttered. "But look here, he skipped wives, left boys under 18 alone. It's like he followed his own set of rules." Ruth Ann's name appeared in Eli's notes only as store witness. When they called her in, she stared at the board, hand over her mouth. "I knew they were up to more. I didn't know it was all this." What Eli had built to save his claim now helped tear open the whole ring. His pages became law's backbone. That didn't make the blood any less real. It just meant the story of why got written in black and white. News of the massacre and the papers behind it spread faster than any fire. At Dot's Diner on Main Street, every stool was full the next week. Coffee cups clinked, forks scraped plates. Talk grew sharp. "He's a butcher," one Hensley cousin snapped. "I don't care what some deed says, you don't line men up like animals." An old farmer at the end of the counter shook his head. "Cal shouldn't have messed with that spring. Eli went too far, yeah, but don't pretend we all know how that code runs." Ruth Ann sat in a corner booth, untouched pie in front of her. She'd talked to the sheriff. She knew Eli's letters had hit desks before the guns did. Hearing folks pick sides twisted her stomach. A younger man with a ball cap asked, "Why didn't he just sue? Go to Lexington, get a big lawyer?" An older woman snorted. "You think some city judge cares about whose granddaddy set which fence post? They only see what's stamped. Cal got there first." That was the heart of it. On paper, in fresh ink, Cal had nearly claimed Eli's world. Eli had tried, late and in his own careful way, to fight back with documents. When that path seemed slow and thin, he'd reached for something older and far more final. Outside the diner window, life rolled on. Buses stopped, kids laughed by the crosswalk. Yet inside, every word kept circling one question. Was Eli only a monster? Or a man who believed no one else would ever guard what his people had built? The morning after the bodies were found, the law went looking for Eli. They didn't have to hunt far. His truck sat by the McCrae porch. He was on the top step, coat on, hands resting on his knees. The rifle that had spoken across that pasture lay unloaded on the boards beside him. Sheriff Ramsey stepped out first. "Eli?" he called, voice low. "Don't reach for anything now." Eli lifted his hands slowly. "I'm done," he said. "Ain't going nowhere." Troopers moved in, cuffs clicking around weathered wrists. Mary Jo stood in the doorway, face gray, one hand on the frame to steady herself. Danny and Joel were nowhere to be sight. Maybe hiding, maybe already on the road trying to outrun a last name that had just turned poison. As they loaded Eli into the cruiser, ATF trucks rolled past, headed toward the Hensley Ridge. Agents and windbreakers swept through empty sheds and creek bottoms. seizing copper, jars, and mash still warm to the touch. Every setup they found matched spots Eli had sketched. Power shifted in a single day. For years, Cal and his crowd had moved money in jars with a sense that nobody would piece it all together. Now their work lay tagged and stacked as evidence. The man who'd forced that into the open sat in a back seat, staring at his own boots. On the ride to town, Eli said nothing. He watched fence posts slide by in the window glass. Each cedar stake marked a line he'd tried to guard with pen and finally with gun. Months later, the courthouse that had once seen Eli as a quiet figure by the records desk became the stage for his fate. The trial drew reporters from Lexington and beyond. Trucks with satellite dishes clogged streets that had never seen such attention. Inside, stained wood benches filled with McCraes, Hensleys, and folks who just wanted to say they'd been there. Prosecutors laid out the case with harsh clarity. They held up Eli's second list and matched each name to a body tag. They showed that he'd mailed his complaints, then gone out with a rifle anyway. He planned this, they said. He chose who lived and who died. The defense didn't deny the shootings. Instead, they dug into Eli's first set of papers. They walked the jury through old deeds, family maps, and survey shifts. Ray Fletcher's past statements, saved in a stray insurance form, reached the stand by way of a clerk. Linda Carmichael, now on the other side, admitted, Mr. McCrae's claims about the land and spring were supported by the documents he provided. His legacy was at risk. Jury members shifted in their seats. The law book was clear on murder. It was thinner on what a man should do when the ground under his whole name was pulled away. Verdicts came heavy. Guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder. Life in prison. No parole for decades. In a smaller hearing, with less attention, the judge signed an order that settled the landline. Based on records, some of them copied by Eli himself, the pasture and spring fell under the McCrae Trust. On paper, he had won the fight he started. In chains, he left the room while clerks stamped the orders that proved he'd been right. Prisons swallowed Eli like a mine shaft. Concrete yards replaced rolling pasture. Razor wire stood where fence posts had been. Years blurred into each other, marked only by work shifts, roll calls, and the slow shuffle of older men along painted lines. Eli kept to himself. He worked in the laundry. He read worn paperbacks. He stared out narrow windows when snow fell, thinking of the ridge back home. Guards said he was quiet, polite, never caused trouble. Danny came at first. Visits were stiff. Father and son sat across metal tables in a gray room, the sound of other families' talk bouncing off cinder block walls. "You got the land," Danny said once. "Deed's clear. People know it's ours." Eli looked at his hands. "You using it?" he asked. "No, can't. Folks see us still on that hill again, they'll burn us down. Might just graze cattle. Maybe sell it someday." Joel stopped by once or twice, then not at all. Life pulled him toward other states, other jobs, places where his last name meant nothing. Mary Jo aged fast. Her letters came less often as her hands shook. One thin envelope in a stack of prison mail told Eli she was gone, buried on the hill near her people. The recipe stayed in a safe deposit box, its paper yellowing in a dark drawer. No one stirred that mash. No one bragged on its smoothness at gatherings. Eli died in his sleep, another inmate told the chaplain. His heart simply gave out. The file clerk logged his passing, and the world outside rolled forward. He had guarded the shell of his legacy. Inside, though, it lay empty. Back in the hollow, the families left behind tried to live with what remained. On a soft May morning, the hilltop cemetery filled with people and plastic flowers. Decoration Day brought both McCrae's and Hensley's to the same slope, their paths crossing among stones and little flags. Danny knelt by a simple marker bearing Elias McCrae, beloved husband and father. He brushed dirt from the carved letters. Joel stood back, hands in pockets, eyes fixed on the far tree line rather than the name. "There's an offer on the land," Danny said quietly. "Some fella wants to run cattle, says he doesn't care about history." Joel shrugged. "Might be better," he replied. "Let someone else look at that oak every day." Down the row, Hensley widows tended graves marked with the same death date. Children, now teens, set mason jars full of wildflowers on their father's stones. One boy's jaw clenched as he glanced toward Eli's marker. "Do they talk about him at school?" a widow asked. "Yeah," the boy muttered. "Some say he's a monster, some say Papa had it coming. I don't know what to think." Stories split like that in small places. At supper tables, one version held but Cal was just doing what he had to for his family, and Eli snapped. At others, the tale said Cal broke an old promise, and Eli paid too high a price to keep it. Kids grew up caught between those two fires, carrying a weight they hadn't earned. Time didn't stop for that hollow. It just changed its clothes. The old wooden store where Ruth Ann had once rung up bread and jars turned into a bright gas station with a chain logo. A wall of coolers held energy drinks and cold beer. Slim plastic cards hung where handwritten IOUs had once sat in a ledger. Trucks now rolled out to big box stores in nearby towns. Many locals drove farther for work, punching clocks in warehouses instead of mines. Pills, then meth, replaced clear liquor as the poison of choice. New dealers had no use for springs or recipes. Their trade came in blister packs and baggies. If you asked some of the younger clerks about that shooting years back, they might frown and say, "Was that the one by the old oak? My granddad talks about it sometimes." The details, sharp and painful to an older generation, blurred like an old TV signal to those raised on satellites and phones. At the courthouse, Eli's land case gathered dust in a drawer. Clerks used the same file cabinets for zoning requests and car titles. Few ever pulled the worn folder marked McCrae v. Hensley, though it sat there, a quiet reminder that once a pasture line almost no outsider could see had driven a man to break his own life in two. Problems that squeezed Eli and Cal never really vanished, they just shifted shape. Economic pain still ran under many doors, even if the tools and temptations looked different. From a true crime desk, many miles and many years away, this story looks neat. A boundary dispute, a stolen recipe, a man who turned to murder. But nothing about it feels neat if you sit with it long enough. Eli McCrae tried to use paper and process first. He copied deeds, wrote letters, and trusted that if he lined his facts up square, some far-off judge or agent would see his worth. When that hope seemed thin, he fell back on a rougher code, one that said a man protects his own, no matter the cost. Calvin Hensley knew that same code. He also knew how slow and loose formal rules could be in places like this. So he bent surveys, charmed cousins, and treated Eli's legacy as a business asset to cut and sell. Both men loved their families. Both believed in legacy, in giving their sons more than empty pockets. One chose quiet theft wrapped in charm. The other chose loud, final violence. The law arrived late, but spoke clear. Murder is murder, even when wrapped in old hurt. Yet that same law, in its slower, colder way, also confirmed that Eli's fear of erasure wasn't madness. On paper, he had been right about the land. Which failure weighs heavier? The system that does not see certain kinds of theft until it is too late, or the man who decides that because of that gap, he'll be judge, jury, and executioner? These are not easy answers. They are knots of blood, pride, and history that sit heavy over many hollers and small towns. Today, if you walk up that ridge at sunset, you'll find the old boundary oak in bad shape. Lightning split its trunk years ago. One side leans, dead limbs reaching toward a pale sky. Rust flakes off a "No Trespassing" McCrae sign nailed there long ago. Weeds crowd the fence. Cows from a new owner graze without knowing what lines they cross. On a modern land map, the pasture sits inside clean McCrae-marked parcels just as Eli had claimed. A clerk can pull it up on a screen in seconds. Somewhere in a bank box, the mash recipe still rests, letters faded but readable. No one weaves that mash on moonlit nights now. No one boasts about its smooth bite over a game of cards. The legacy stands, but only as a story, stiff and brittle as old paper. When you hear people dismiss tales like this as hillbilly feuds, remember the weight behind them: shrinking jobs, deep pride, and systems that don't always see what matters most to the people who live far from their halls. If this story has stayed with you, if you see your own family's fights over land, work, or name in it, you can leave a comment and share your thoughts. And if you want to go deeper into more dark, true stories from places like these, you can subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Now I'll leave you with a question. If everything your people had ever owned boiled down to a patch of ground and a secret in a jar, how far would you go? And how far should you go to keep someone else from taking it?